On a misty Halloween night in Marymead, laughter turned to screams as a widow fell dead at her own masquerade. A chilling mystery begins tonight. Where are you listening from? Let's tell me in the comment. It was the sort of evening Marymead hadn't seen in years, a night when laughter echoed down the cobbled lanes, when paper lanterns flickered in cottage windows, and even the air seemed charmed with the spirit of Halloween. The village hall, decked with orange bunting and sprigs of autumn ivy, was alive with chatter. The annual Masquerade Ball, organized by Mrs. Penelope Weatherby, the wealthy widow of the late Colonel Weatherby, had drawn nearly everyone within 10 miles. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, was knitting something in soft lavender wool. Though she had no mask, no dramatic feathers or glittering gown, her presence was unobtrusive but curiously grounding, like the single candle that refused to flicker, no matter how strong the wind. Around her, the guests swirled in a medley of silks and satin, pirates, witches, phantoms, and even a pharaoh whose papier-mâché crown kept slipping sideways. The band struck up a waltz, and Mrs. Weatherby glided across the floor, in an elaborate black gown trimmed with sequins, her mask a delicate lace spiderweb. Her laughter carried easily, a little too loud, a little too bright. Some said she'd invited her late husband's business partner that evening, a certain Mr. Adrian Vale, who had only recently returned from Cairo. Others whispered that her new companion was young Mr. Peter Ransom, the handsome local architect who'd been seen leaving her estate more than once at suspiciously late hours. At 10 minutes past 9, the lights flickered once, twice, and went out entirely. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a shriek that seemed half fright, half delight, until the music stopped abruptly. Then came another sound, the clatter of a chair, the rush of skirts, and a low moan from near the refreshments table. When the lights finally blinked back on, Mrs. Weatherby lay sprawled across the parquet floor, her lace mask torn, her skin pale beneath the rouge. The spiderweb design now resembled something far more sinister, splattered with a single dark stain that spread slowly across the sequins of her gown. The room froze into horrified silence. Then voices erupted all at once, cries for help, for a doctor, for someone to call Inspector Craddock from the local station. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing her knitting aside, and moved toward the body with quiet purpose. She didn't push or exclaim, merely observed. Her eyes missed nothing. The half-empty champagne flute toppled nearby, the faint scent of bitter almonds in the air, and the curious pattern of crushed confetti leading toward the side door. Outside, the October wind moaned against the eaves, and a few stray leaves scuttled across the doorstep as though carrying secrets of their own. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though she murmured softly to no one in particular. "Ah, how often merriment and malice dance arm in arm." The police arrived soon after, led by Inspector Craddock himself, whose booming voice filled the hall with orders. "No one leaves until we've taken statements. This is a crime scene." The villagers huddled together, their masks suddenly less like costumes and more like veils of guilt. Miss Marple stood quietly by the doorway, her eyes following the faint smear of spilled champagne that led from the table to where the candles had guttered out. Vale was sweating despite the chill. How Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, clutched her shawl as if hiding something, and how young Peter Ransom's hands trembled slightly, whether from shock or fear, she could not yet tell. As the body was carefully covered and carried away, Miss Marple turned her gaze to the cracked mirror behind the punch bowl. A reflection caught her. Her own face framed beside that of a painted Venetian mask lying discarded on the floor. A single feather from it quivered in the draught, and in that quiet, almost imperceptible tremor, Miss Marple's mind began its work, piecing together the human threads that had led, inevitably, to murder. Inspector Craddock cordoned off the refreshment table and sent a constable to the side door, where the confetti trail thinned and vanished into the October dark. The band, white-faced and suddenly subdued, packed away their instruments while the clock over the stage clicked on with unfeeling regularity. Miss Hartwell, the village nurse in a Tudor ruff, had knelt where Mrs. Weatherby fell and said the words everyone heard but no one accepted. After that, the hall became a place of careful voices and unsteady hands, tea brewed too strong, shawls pulled tight, glances skittering like moths around a lamp. The first questions came briskly. Who poured the champagne? When did the lights fail? Who stood nearest the widow? Answers arrived in overlapping streams, correcting and contradicting in the way small villages have perfected. Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, blushed under her witch's hat and insisted she had refilled the punch but never touched the bottles on the tray. Mrs. Weatherby, she said, always took a flute like a lady. Mr. Adrian Vale, his pharaoh crown abandoned on a chair, declared he had been by the orchestra, discussing a subscription for the church roof when the darkness came down. Peter Ransom, trying not to shred his glove, stated he had offered the widow a dance, and she laughed and told him he was far too young. Said with that airy kindness which can soothe or sting, depending who hears it, Miss Marple, who had neither questioned nor answered, drifted to the side door and looked at the sill. Confetti had been ground into the wood like iridescent scales. A single leaf, brown and fragile, had blown in and caught on the hinge. It was damp, though step outside was dry. A door often remembers when people do not, she murmured, not so much to be heard as to allow her thought the dignity of words. On her way back, she stooped and lifted a Venetian mask whose long black feather had trembled earlier in the draught. The inner surface felt faintly tacky, as though a sweet drop had dried there. She set it where the light could find it and moved on without fuss. Craddock appeared at her elbow, notebook open. "What did you notice, Miss Marple?" "Only trifles," she said mildly. "They so often are, until one adds them properly." A bitter scent, like a crushed kernel, when the lights returned, and a draught through the side door, when there ought not to have been one. "You smelt it?" His pencil paused. "I am afraid one does not easily forget it," she answered. "When I was a girl, a neighbor kept a bottle for her garden. It was very effective and very wicked." Cyanide is not shy. Craddock's mouth became a line, which means planning, not impulse or experience, Miss Marple said gently. "One does not usually spoil good champagne unless one is quite sure the glass will reach the right lips." Statements proceeded on the stage, each witness stepping into the spill of light like a reluctant extra after the curtain. Gossip moved underneath, soft as rain behind a hedge. Mrs. Bantry confided that the widow and Mr. Vale had once been too friendly until Colonel Weatherby put an end to it, and that crosswords were heard in the widow's garden last Wednesday. The grocer's wife maintained Peter Ransom had accepted advances on work not yet drawn, and that Mrs. Weatherby liked to dangle hopes and tighten purse strings. The verger recollected a harlequin figure near the refreshments before the blackout. Little Elsie Drew insisted it might have been a Pierrot because masks change like faces in the dark. No one could agree whether the music stopped first or the scream came first, which is how truth behaves when fear is present. When Miss Marple's turn came, she spoke briefly. The toppled flute, the draught, the damp leaf within, the tacky mask, and the smell, she added, the sort one would not wish in a room with cake. Craddock sent a constable to collect bottles and trays. One bottle, half empty, showed a faint crystalline ring just inside the neck. It bore no label, one of the colonel's decanted prizes kept for show. Mrs. Turner twisted her work-roughened hands and said she had fetched what the butler used to fetch, the good ones she liked to bring out. At that, Mr. Vale shot her a look that tried to be impersonal and failed, while Mrs. Bantry murmured that display is a habit some never unlearn. The caretaker, Mr. Briggs, a square man in a brown suit unsoftened by festivity, was fetched to answer for the lights. Fuse blew. he said. "Whole board's temperamental," told the committee last month. "Wind rattles that side door and jars the lot sometimes. I planed the edge last week. Asked about the cellar. He hesitated only a heartbeat, but long enough for attention to collect, then said it was locked, so far as I know. A constable returned to report the cellar secure, yet a bunch of keys lay in an unlocked drawer on the stage as if someone had been careless, or else very deliberate and hoped to be taken for careless. Through all of it, Miss Marple watched people rather than things. Peter Ransom's gaze slid too often to Mr. Vale. Resentment showed there, and also fear, like ink that refuses to dry. Vale's composure was the kind one rehearses in a mirror, every breath measured. Mrs. Turner's eyes, when they rested on the empty space where Mrs. Weatherby had been, held a tenderness that did not include admiration. Patterns suggested themselves, then shifted, as patterns do before they settle. The cloakroom produced the first firm thread, Tommy Briggs. The caretaker's solemn little nephew, dressed as a pirate, tugged Miss Marple's sleeve. "Please, miss, I found a thing when it went dark." He brought from his pocket a folded chemist's packet with a smudged crease. When opened, it gave off a breath like a bitten apple. "Where did you find it, dear?" Miss Marple asked. "In the cloakroom, stuck under the shelf by the hooks. My sword poked it." "You have done quite right to bring it to an elder," she said, "which always makes children noble and men careful." She placed it in Craddock's hand. "We'll have it tested," he said quietly, "and we'll see whose cloak might have dislodged it." "Perhaps also," Miss Marple murmured, "whose cloak was hung in a flurry after a ribbon snapped, for instance. People are careless when they think themselves invisible, and no one is invisible in Mary Mead." Outside, the wind combed the hedges, leaves hissed along the pavement. Inside, the hall remembered that it was only boards and paint and human breath. Tea arrived. The vicar offered a brief prayer. Miss Hartwell folded the sheet tighter over what gaiety had left, and Craddock announced that no one would depart without permission. People sighed and settled, some bravely, some sullenly. Miss Marple closed her eyes as if to rest and opened them again upon the cracked mirror behind the punch bowl. In that uncertain glass, she saw three reflections touch and separate. Adrian Vale, adjusting his tie, Peter Ransom rubbing a dark fleck from his cuff, and Mrs. Turner watching both men with a look that could not decide between pity and dislike. Miss Marple's needles lay idle. The wool would keep. Human threads, once knotted, do not unravel. They travel, tugging at what they are tied to. And somewhere between a damp leaf and a borrowed bottle, between a sticky mask and a child's pirate sword, the knot had already begun to tighten. By morning, the village lay beneath a pale, bruised sky, and the revelry of the night before had already curdled into scandal. Word spread faster than smoke through a chimney. Mrs. Weatherby poisoned at her own masquerade, and the whole of Mary Mead abuzz with theories, each more dramatic than the last. Mrs. Bantry insisted it was the foreign gentleman. "They always bring trouble, my dear." While others whispered that jealousy had finally driven young Peter Ransom past his limit. Only Miss Marple, in her modest pink cardigan, moved through the gossip like a swan among ducks. Her eyes gentle, her thoughts very far away. Inspector Craddock arrived at the Weatherby estate just after breakfast, a solid, no-nonsense man whose patience often faltered in the face of village theatrics. Yet when Miss Marple appeared at the gate, he simply nodded. "Thought you might," he said dryly. "Can't keep you away, can we?" She smiled. "One does feel a sense of duty, Inspector, especially when human nature misbehaves so thoroughly." Inside, the late widow's drawing room was a portrait of calculated charm, velvet curtains, framed landscapes, and a faint smell of lavender polish. The champagne bottle from the hall stood on the table beside a tray of untouched cakes. Craddock motioned to the constable. "We've confirmed cyanide, just as you thought. A concentrated dose, enough to kill within seconds." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the bottle, then on the lace gloves folded beside it. Curious, she murmured. Mrs. Weatherby was never careless with her possessions. She prided herself on appearances even after her husband's death. Craddock's brow furrowed. Meaning she didn't fetch her own drink? Oh, no, Miss Marple said softly. Someone else would have made sure her glass was properly filled. People who like control rarely serve themselves. The inspector jotted that down, though without conviction. He turned as Peter Ransom was shown in pale, weary, but trying to appear calm. He looked younger in daylight, his confidence from the previous night washed away. "Inspector," he began, "I thought I should come. I've nothing to hide," Miss Marple observed quietly as Craddock questioned him. Peter admitted he'd quarrelled with Mrs. Weatherby 2 days earlier over payment delays, he said, though his tone carried something warmer, more personal. When asked where he'd been during the blackout, he hesitated just too long. "By the orchestra," he said finally, "near the curtains." After he left, Craddock muttered, "He's lying, or half of him is." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but guilt and fear look remarkably alike, don't they? The difference is, in the eyes, guilt glances back, fear looks sideways." They were interrupted by Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, clutching her apron. Her face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I can't believe she's gone," she whispered. She wasn't easy, but she was kind in her way. She paused. "I saw her talking with Mr. Vale before the music started." He looked angry. That name again, Mr. Adrian Vale. The exotic business partner, the smooth traveller returned from abroad. Craddock arranged to meet him at the inn where he was staying, and Miss Marple quietly accompanied. Mr. Vale greeted them in a crisp dressing gown, his manner confident yet brittle. "A dreadful business," he said, offering coffee that no one accepted. Penelope was reckless, always inviting envy, always drawing attention. His tone carried a shade too much ease. Miss Marple studied his hands, steady, manicured, the nails too perfect for a man who claimed to have managed plantations in Egypt. On the mantelpiece, a small silver flask gleamed faintly. "A handsome piece," she remarked lightly. "A gift from Mrs. Weatherby, perhaps?" He hesitated just for a second. "Yes, from years ago." "Before or after the Colonel's passing?" she asked sweetly. His smile stiffened. "Does it matter?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "Timing matters terribly in all things, especially in poisons and affection." As they left, Craddock exhaled sharply. "You think he's our man?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Her gaze lingered on a faint smudge at the flask's hinge, a trace of something pale and powdery. "No," she said finally. "He's too practiced, but someone very near him is not. And such people often mistake imitation for love." Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying the rustle of leaves along the lane like whispers that refused to die. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer, her voice barely above the breeze. "We must look not at who hated Mrs. Weatherby, but who admired her too much. Devotion, when bruised, is far deadlier than hatred." The afternoon light slanted across the village green, soft and deceptive, as if trying to cover the shadow the masquerade had left behind. In the post office queue, people spoke in lowered tones how strange that a woman as formidable as Mrs. Weatherby should die so suddenly, and at her own party too. Mrs. Bantry swore she had seen the widow quarrel with Adrian Vale over a letter, while others claimed the vicar's wife had found a torn piece of lace near the punch bowl. By evening, the murder had grown a dozen new arms, each pointing in a different direction. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window overlooking the lane, a teacup cooling beside her, her knitting untouched. Her mind moved gently through what she knew. A poison that acted swiftly, a glass that reached only one set of lips, and a trail of behavior as telling as fingerprints. What had Mrs. Weatherby been hiding behind that glittering facade of charm and charity? and who had waited patiently for the mask to slip. At dusk, Inspector Craddock stopped by her cottage. His hat was pushed back, and his notebook looked more dog-eared than ever. "I've just come from the chemist," he said, lowering his voice. "That packet your young pirate found residue of potassium cyanide. Prescription bottle from Mr. Vale's luggage matched the same supplier." Miss Marple poured him tea before answering. "Cyanide in a man's belongings doesn't make him a murderer, Inspector, though it does make him rather careless." He frowned. "Careless isn't the word I'd use." "Oh, I think it is," she said calmly. "A man who travels with such things must either be confident of his safety or sure that no one will look too closely. Confidence, I've noticed, often precedes discovery." Craddock sighed. "Then you think he did it after all?" Miss Marple shook her head. No. He's far too aware of how he appears. The truly guilty often forget they're being observed." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, wrapped in her worn shawl, eyes swollen from crying or perhaps from fear. I thought I should tell someone," she began, twisting her hands. "There's something missing from the mistress's room. Her locket, the one she never took off. Gold, with a picture of her husband inside." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "When did you last see it?" "Before the ball. She laid it on the dressing table while I helped her with the gown. Said the chain felt tight. Then, perhaps it fell during the evening?" Mrs. Turner hesitated. "No, ma'am. I checked the floor this morning. The chain was snapped clean, not broken, as if pulled." Craddock straightened. "That could fit with a struggle. Or," said Miss Marple softly, "it could fit with something more subtle. A sentimental theft. People sometimes take tokens rather than valuables. A keepsake to remember. Or to reproach." The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the Weatherby estate herself. The garden, once a pride of the village, looked oddly neglected, the autumn roses already losing their color. She noticed a chair, dragged near the French doors, its leg sunk in the damp soil. Bending, she picked up a thin chain fragment, glinting faintly in the mud. Not far off, a cigarette stub rested in the grass, Turkish, not local. She tucked both into her pocket and went inside. In the drawing room, Peter Ransom stood by the hearth, his expression drawn. "They say Vale's to be charged," he said when she entered. "But it wasn't him. I know it." "Do you, Mr. Ransom?" "Yes." He swallowed. "Mrs. Weatherby, she was kind, in her way. But she liked control. She promised help with my commission and then withdrew it. I was angry, but I'd never harm her. Anger and harm are cousins, Mr. Ransom. But I don't believe you did, either. Tell me, did you see anyone near the refreshment table when the lights went out?" He hesitated, looking toward the window. "I saw movement. A woman's shape. I thought it was Mrs. Turner, but the dress was lighter. Silver, maybe." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Ah, silver. Mrs. Turner wore dark green, as I recall. But Mrs. Bantry, she had a silver gown, didn't she? And a fondness for mischief." Peter gave a weary laugh. "I doubt she's capable of murder." "No," Miss Marple said, almost wistfully. "But capable of curiosity, yes, and curiosity sometimes leads people to places they'd rather not be seen." As she left the estate, she met Mrs. Bantry herself, bustling up the lane with her usual briskness. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "I've just heard the police found something dreadful, Mrs. Weatherby's locket, in a man's coat pocket." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, her eyes brightening. "And whose coat might that be?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice dramatically. "Mr. Vale's, of course." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course," she said. "How very neat." Yet, as she walked home, her mind turned not to neatness, but to timing, how very quickly that piece of evidence had been found, and by whom. The truth, she thought, was beginning to show its face. And as with all masks, it was never the one people expected. The discovery of the locket in Adrian Vale's coat pocket sent the entire village into a fever of certainty. To most, it was proof enough a foreign gentleman, a past entanglement, a poison conveniently in his luggage, and now the dead woman's keepsake among his belongings. Inspector Craddock, though not a man to leap at conclusions, had to admit the evidence fit rather neatly. Yet Miss Marple, when informed, merely smiled, the faintest of smiles, the kind that said she had seen too many tidy packages come apart at the seams. "It's too soon, Inspector," she said, stirring her tea. "When everyone agrees so quickly, it's usually because they wish to stop thinking." Craddock sighed. "We found the locket ourselves this morning during the search. No one else was near it." "Ah," she said mildly. "But you didn't find it last night, did you? Strange how incriminating things like to appear after a good night's rest." He frowned but didn't argue. He knew better than to dismiss her gentle remarks. They had a habit of turning up useful. That evening, while Craddock arranged for Vale's formal questioning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Turner. The housekeeper lived in a narrow cottage behind the churchyard, where the light smelled faintly of coal and lavender soap. She seemed uneasy as she opened the door. "I've nothing more to tell you, miss," she said quickly. "The police have asked their questions, and I've told them what I know." "I'm sure you have," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "But you see, I'm rather curious about your loyalty to Mrs. Weatherby. You spoke of her with affection, and yet I fancy she didn't make life very easy for you." Mrs. Turner's eyes darted to the floor. She liked things just so. "The Colonel used to say she was born to command." "Command," repeated Miss Marple softly. "A dangerous gift, that. It earns devotion and resentment in equal measure." After a long pause, Mrs. Turner whispered, "She was kind once, before he died. After that, she wasn't herself. She suspected Mr. Vale of something, perhaps?" The woman's head lifted sharply. "You heard that? One hears many things in Mary Mead, my dear. Did she tell you what she suspected?" Mrs. Turner hesitated, wringing her hands. "She said he cheated her money, property, something about shares. But she still wrote to him, even after. She said she'd forgive him, but she wanted proof of his remorse." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And when remorse doesn't come, forgiveness turns bitter." "I see." As she left, the church bell chimed 8. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke, and the narrow lane glistened faintly under the lamplight. Miss Marple walked home thoughtfully. She had seen grief take strange shapes before it could turn to cruelty or obsession, sometimes both. The next morning brought new confusion. Inspector Craddock, looking weary, called on her again. "You'll like this, Miss Marple," he said grimly. "We've confirmed Mr. Vale's flask, clean as a whistle. No trace of poison. And the chemist says his cyanide was for industrial use, sealed and never opened. The locket, though, that's different. The clasp's been wiped. Someone handled it very recently." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Oh dear, yes. A great many hands can pass over one small trinket, especially when emotions run high. Who had access to Mr. Vale's coat before you found it?" "Half the village, it seems," Craddock muttered. "The search team, the constable, even Mrs. Bantry. She claims she was helping tidy the room." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mrs. Bantry does like to be useful. She has a knack for tidying what others would rather leave messy." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hall where the ball had been held. The decorations were half torn down, the air still faintly scented with wax and flowers. Near the corner of the refreshment table, she found what she had been looking for, a small ribbon fragment, silver-threaded, caught in a floorboard crack. She lifted it delicately. It matched the trim of a gown she had seen that night, Mrs. Bantry's, bright and fluttering under the candlelight. When she returned home, she found Mrs. Bantry herself waiting, face flushed with excitement. "My dear, I've just come from the station. They're saying Mr. Vale may be released, can you imagine? After all that evidence." Miss Marple poured her tea with perfect calm. "The law likes to be thorough, my dear. But tell me, why were you tidying Mr. Vale's coat last night? Such an odd task for a guest." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Oh, I only brushed a bit of mud off. I noticed it when the constable laid it on the chair." "And found something while doing so?" Her hand froze on the cup. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've been eager, too eager to share what the police discovered. One always is, when one's conscience wishes to spread the burden." Mrs. Bantry's face paled. "You think I planted that locket? Good heavens, Jane." "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that you picked it up without understanding what you'd done. Curiosity is an old friend of yours, and opportunity even older. You may not have killed anyone, my dear, but you've made it harder to see who did." Mrs. Bantry's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Then who?" she whispered. Miss Marple looked into the fire. The one who knew the locket's absence would draw suspicion, and the one Mrs. Weatherby trusted most. Devotion, as I said, is the most dangerous emotion of all. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the kind of English morning that seemed to press the mist right into the bones of the village. The Halloween decorations had been taken down, but the feeling of masquerade still lingered, faces smiling in daylight that had hidden darker emotions in the candlelit hall. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage promptly at 9, his expression grim and the usual briskness replaced by weariness. "We've released Vale," he said, setting his hat on the table. "No case strong enough to hold him. He's indignant, of course, and planning to leave by tomorrow. Says he's had enough of English hospitality." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, a faint smile touching her lips. How unwise! The guilty so often wish to flee, and the innocent rarely can. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think he's guilty after all?" "No," she said thoughtfully. "I think he's frightened. But not of the gallows, of what might come to light before he goes. People who've built lives on delicate illusions prefer not to see them shattered." Craddock frowned. "You've got something, haven't you? What is it?" "Not proof, my dear Inspector, only threads. And threads can unravel anything, if one tugs gently enough." Before he could press her further, a knock came at the door. It was Peter Ransom, looking pale and drawn, his coat damp from the drizzle. "I had to speak with you," he said quickly. "It's about Mrs. Turner." Miss Marple motioned him to sit. "The housekeeper?" "What about her?" "She's gone," he said. "Packed her things and left early this morning. The vicar's wife saw her walking toward the station with a suitcase. Said she looked half ill." Craddock muttered an oath. "Gone, is she?" Convenient timing. Miss Marple's expression was calm, though her eyes sharpened. Mrs. Turner was devoted to Mrs. Weatherby, too devoted, perhaps. When such attachments break, they leave deep wounds. She might feel the village turning against her, or she might fear something else entirely. Craddock stood. "We'll send a man to the station. If she's still there, we'll have her brought in." Miss Marple rose and fetched her shawl. "No, I think I'll come along myself. There's something fragile about this business, and one mustn't frighten delicate things into silence." The train had not yet left when they reached the small station. Mrs. Turner sat alone on the far bench, a worn carpet-bag beside her. Her hands were folded tightly, the knuckles white, eyes fixed on the damp horizon. When she saw Miss Marple approaching, she started visibly but did not rise. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her, "you'll catch your death waiting in this chill. Where are you going?" "London," she whispered. "I've a cousin there. She said I could help in her shop." "A kind offer," Miss Marple said. "But you haven't told her the real reason, have you?" Mrs. Turner's lip trembled. "I can't stay here, miss. They'll say I did it." "I didn't, but they'll say it just the same." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "you should tell me what you do know. Because if you go now, The wrong person may bear the blame. The housekeeper pressed her hands together until they shook. She trusted me. I'd been with her 15 years. I knew all her ways. But that night she was different. Nervous. She told me to fetch the special bottle from the cabinet, the one with the good French label. I poured her glass myself, just as always. She swallowed. Then I went to fetch her shawl. When I came back, she was laughing with Mr. Vale, and her glass was gone. I never saw it again until she fell. Craddock leaned forward. "You're certain no one else touched the drink?" Mrs. Turner hesitated. I don't know. There was someone behind me at the table when I left. I thought it was Miss Hartwell, the nurse. She wore that long silver dress. But it might have been someone else. I only saw the sleeve." Miss Marple laid a hand on hers. "You did nothing wrong, my dear. You were caught in another person's shadow. But you mustn't run from it. You'll only make that shadow darker." Tears welled in Mrs. Turner's eyes. I couldn't bear them looking at me. She was like family. Miss Marple gave her a small, kind smile. "Yes, and families, dear Mrs. Turner, often kill more thoroughly than strangers." The train whistle blew, shrill and final, as though warning them that time was slipping away. Mrs. Turner bowed her head, whispering something Miss Marple couldn't quite catch. A single word, "forgiven." Later, as they walked back toward the village, Craddock broke the silence. "Forgiven," he said slowly. "You think she meant Mrs. Weatherby forgave someone, or that she wanted forgiveness herself?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted under the grey sky. "Perhaps both. But forgiveness, Inspector, can sometimes be a weapon. Mrs. Weatherby may have offered it to someone who couldn't live under its weight." Craddock sighed. "Then where does that leave us?" "Very near the truth," Miss Marple said. "If I'm not mistaken, the mask that smiled the widest on that Halloween night is about to slip, and when it does, we shall see not guilt alone, but desperation." The fog clung to Mary Mead like a curtain, muffling sound and softening outlines so that even the cottages looked slightly unreal. Miss Marple, walking home from the station with Inspector Craddock, felt the quiet pressing around them, an uneasy quiet that spoke of things not yet said. The street lamps flickered pale and thin through the mist, and far off a dog barked once and fell silent. Craddock's boots scraped against the gravel. "So, Mrs. Turner didn't poison her mistress," he said finally. "But she might have been used without knowing it." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. She poured the champagne. "Yes, but the substitution must have occurred afterward. Someone nearby slipped something into that glass while her back was turned. Someone confident enough to act in a crowd." Craddock frowned. "That points us right back to Vale. He was the one standing nearest." "Perhaps," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But you'll remember Mrs. Turner described a silver sleeve. Vale wore black. The person who poisoned that glass may have been quite literally dressed for the part, a costume of light, not darkness." As they neared her gate, a figure appeared from the mist, Peter Ransom, his expression tight with worry. "Miss Marple," he called, "I think you should see something. It's about Mrs. Weatherby's desk." "Her desk?" Craddock repeated. "Yes," Peter said breathlessly. "The police sealed the study, but the caretaker let me in. I thought I might find her architectural notes. Instead, I found this." He held out a small folded letter, the paper yellowed and sealed with dark red wax. "It's addressed to Adrian Vale in her handwriting." Miss Marple took it gently. "Have you read it, Mr. Ransom?" He shook his head. "No, I thought it best not to." Craddock broke the seal and unfolded the sheet. The ink had faded, but the words were sharp enough to chill the air around them. "You think me a fool, Adrian, but I know what you did. I trusted you, and you betrayed both my husband's memory and my purse. If you come to me again, I will expose you. And yet, part of me still pities you. You once had goodness in you I shall test if any remains." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the last sentence. A test, she murmured. Yes, that sounds like her. Mrs. Weatherby liked to play with human nature as others play cards. Craddock folded the letter again. So, she baited him, and he killed her for it. Someone feared what that test might reveal. That evening, as the fog thickened, Miss Marple walked alone to the village hall. The decorations were gone, but the scent of wax and wilted flowers still hung in the air. She moved to the spot where Mrs. Weatherby had fallen, then to the refreshment table. A faint stain remained on the polished wood where the glass had spilled. She imagined the scene again, the laughter, the flickering candles, the momentary darkness. She could almost hear the soft slide of fabric, the quick motion of a hand. The door creaked behind her. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said. It was Miss Hartwell, the nurse, standing in the doorway with her coat half-buttoned. They said the hall was closed. "Curiosity," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "is a disease I've yet to cure." Miss Hartwell hesitated, then came closer. "I suppose you're trying to see how she fell. Terrible business. I can still hear the scream." "Can you?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. So few can remember it clearly. "Tell me, my dear, when the lights went out, where were you?" "By the bandstand, I think," she said quickly, helping a guest who tripped. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to her sleeve, pale silver wool, the same shade as the costume described by Mrs. Turner. "That must have been kind of you. Did you ever know Mrs. Weatherby well?" Miss Hartwell's lips tightened. "Not especially. I nursed her husband years ago. She treated him dreadfully, always scolding, always certain she knew best." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "A common ailment, people who mistake domination for care." She let the silence stretch until Miss Hartwell looked away. "You were fond of the Colonel, I think." The nurse's face flushed. "He was a good man," she said shortly. "Better than she deserved." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet, she wore his picture round her neck every day. Grief can be possessive, don't you find, even of the dead?" For a moment, Miss Hartwell said nothing. Then her voice came low, almost trembling. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. She mocked him even in death. That locket, she only wore it to remind people she'd been a victim. I couldn't bear to see it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "So you took it from her dressing table?" The nurse froze. "How could you?" "Because only someone who hated the symbol, not the woman, would steal it," Miss Marple said gently. "And only someone who knew the properties of cyanide, someone accustomed to medicine, could measure just enough to kill swiftly and without waste." Miss Hartwell's hands shook. "She ruined him," she whispered. "Ruined everyone around her. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose control just for once. But I didn't mean—" Miss Marple's tone was kind, almost sorrowful. "No one ever does. The darkness is brief, the deed quicker still. And then, of course, one must live with daylight again." Craddock stepped from the shadows behind the stage, his face grave. "I heard enough," he said quietly. The nurse gave a small, hopeless nod. "I only wanted her to stop hurting people." Miss Marple's eyes, though filled with pity, held no surprise. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "it was not hatred that killed Mrs. Weatherby, but mercy twisted out of shape, the most dangerous kind there is." The confession hung in the air, like smoke, thin, bitter, and impossible to ignore. Miss Hartwell stood trembling, her silver sleeve catching the dim light, her face pale as candle wax. For a moment, even Inspector Craddock seemed uncertain how to proceed. The nurse's words had come out not in fury, but with the tired resignation of someone who had carried her guilt too long to fight it anymore. Yet Miss Marple did not look triumphant. She looked almost sorrowful, as though the weight of understanding pressed upon her more heavily than the crime itself. Craddock broke the silence first. "You'll need to come with me, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly. The nurse nodded, eyes downcast. "I know." She reached for her coat, then hesitated. It wasn't supposed to kill her, you know. I only wanted to make her sick, to make her afraid. I thought if she saw her own fragility just once, she might stop tormenting everyone else. But she drank more than I expected. I misjudged the dose. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Poison, my dear, is a most unreliable instrument for teaching lessons. It never obeys the conscience of its wielder. As Craddock led the nurse away, Miss Marple remained in the hall, alone with her thoughts and the echoes of footsteps fading into the fog outside. The decorations were gone, the music long ceased, yet the ghost of that masquerade still lingered, a place of masks, laughter, and the soft shuffle of deceit beneath polished shoes. She could almost see it again. Mrs. Weatherby's laughter, brittle and forced, Miss Hartwell's eyes burning from the shadows, the crowd clapping as though tragedy were just another part of the evening's entertainment. By morning, the news had spread. Miss Hartwell's arrest sent ripples through Merry Mead. In the grocer's queue, Mrs. Bantry recounted every rumor she'd heard. At the post office, the clerk insisted she had always known the nurse had a coldness about her. Miss Marple listened to none of it. She had gone to her window early, gazing at the frost settling over the roofs like thin lace, her teacup untouched beside her. Craddock arrived not long after. His usual briskness returned, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. "Well, it's done," he said. Hartwell signed a statement. She claims remorse, says she meant it as punishment, not murder. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, the sort of punishment one reserves for those one cannot forgive. Craddock sat down heavily. I'll never understand it. All that intellect, all that training, and she uses it for this. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Education doesn't change human nature, Inspector. It merely teaches it better manners. You see, Miss Hartwell's grievance wasn't really with Mrs. Weatherby at all. It was with her own helplessness. People who nurse the dying often develop a peculiar illusion. They believe themselves arbiters between life and death. When they meet someone they despise, that illusion tempts them to act upon it. Craddock rubbed the back of his neck. And the locket? Why steal it? To humiliate her, perhaps, or to reclaim something she thought was hers by right. She once loved the Colonel, after all. The locket represented everything she'd lost: the affection, the control, the moral high ground. Taking it was the first step toward justifying the second. Craddock sighed. You make it sound inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly. But human weakness is remarkably consistent. One only needs to look closely enough. He gave her a tired smile. You'll forgive me if I say I hope there aren't many more murders like this in your village. Miss Marple looked out the window at the drifting fog. Oh, I rather think there will be. Human nature doesn't improve. It only rearranges itself. But perhaps the next one will be more cheerful. He laughed despite himself, gathered his hat, and left. The following day brought a strange quiet to Merry Mead, a quiet too complete to feel natural. At the Weatherby estate, workmen boarded the windows and locked away the furniture. Mr. Vale, his dignity still intact but his pride thoroughly bruised, departed on the noon train without looking back. Peter Ransom stayed behind a while longer, walking the garden paths in silence before stopping at Miss Marple's gate that evening. I wanted to thank you, he said, for seeing what no one else did. I'd have sworn it was Vale. Most people would have, Miss Marple replied kindly. The guilty often hide behind the convenient sins of others. Peter hesitated. Do you think Miss Hartwell meant to kill her? I think, said Miss Marple. She meant to play God and forgot that even God, in his wisdom, leaves judgment to time. He looked down, troubled. It all seemed so pointless now. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Evil often is, but truth, Mr. Ransom, is never wasted, even when it comes too late to help the living. He nodded, thanked her again, and left down the lane where the fog was thickest. She watched until he disappeared, then turned back to her knitting. The firelight flickering on her face. Outside, the church bells tolled softly through the mist, a mournful rhythm that seemed to wash the village clean again, and as the sound faded, Miss Marple murmured almost to herself, "The masks have fallen, but people will always find new ones to wear. Halloween comes every year, after all." The days that followed were strangely subdued, as though Mary Mead itself had drawn a long breath and was reluctant to exhale. People spoke of the masquerade in cautious tones now, as if the mere mention of it might stir something best left asleep. Miss Marple's garden, neat as ever, became a quiet refuge for reflection. She spent her mornings pruning roses that had long since surrendered to the cold, her thoughts drifting between what was known and what was merely supposed. Miss Hartwell's confession had satisfied the law, but not entirely Miss Marple's curiosity. Something about the affair still rested askew, like a crooked picture that no one dared to straighten. She noticed it first in the silences, the kind that follow a story told too perfectly. Miss Hartwell had been precise in her details, remorseful in her tone, convincing in every way. And yet, conviction rarely troubles the innocent as much as it comforts the guilty. Still, Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize when a confession was too orderly. Human guilt is messy. Hers had been clean. Late one afternoon, a letter arrived delivered by the postmistress herself, who could barely hide her excitement. "From London, Miss Marple," she said with relish. "Special delivery. Looks quite official." The letter was brief, written on police stationery. Inside was a note from Inspector Craddock. "You were right again, I fear. The chemist's report found inconsistencies in the residue on the champagne glass. The cyanide was bound with traces of sugar and starch, an improvised preparation, not the pure compound Miss Hartwell had access to. Someone altered the mixture. We may have caught the wrong woman." Miss Marple read it twice before folding it neatly beside her teacup. "Ah," she murmured, "so the masks are not done dancing after all." That evening, as dusk pooled in the lanes, she walked toward the Weatherby estate. The gates hung slightly ajar now, the once proud hedges beginning to grow wild. Inside, Peter Ransom was overseeing the removal of furniture. He greeted her with the nervous politeness of a man who feels watched by fate. "I'm afraid there's not much left worth saving," he said. "Most of it will go to auction. It feels wrong, somehow, packing away a dead woman's life." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But sometimes, when one packs too quickly, one leaves behind the things that matter most." Peter frowned slightly. "You mean her papers? I've already sorted those." "Have you?" she asked gently. "All of them?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Everything except the contents of a small writing box. Locked, of course. No key. May I see it?" He led her into the study. The box was elegant, made of dark walnut and brass, the kind of item one might buy for sentiment rather than function. Miss Marple examined the lock, running her fingertip along a thin crack at the hinge. "Ah, poor craftsmanship," she murmured, producing a hairpin from her sleeve. Within moments, the latch gave a soft click. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. She opened it carefully. Inside were 2 dried blossoms, lilies, and a folded page written in Mrs. Weatherby's distinct, looping hand. "To be opened only in the event of my death. Should anything befall me, the truth will rest with the one who loved me least and served me most." Miss Marple looked up. Who else had access to this room? "Only the caretaker," Peter said, "and Mrs. Turner," before she left. "Mrs. Turner," Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, she did seem eager to leave. And guilt doesn't always belong to the one who confesses it, often clings to the one who remains silent. She replaced the note and closed the box. "Mr. Ransom, I believe this box should be taken to Inspector Craddock immediately, and please tell him to examine the remains of the champagne again, particularly for traces of almond oil. I have a feeling our killer was more domestic in their chemistry than professional." The following morning brought confirmation. Craddock himself arrived. wind-blown and grim. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said. "We found almond extract traces, just as you suggested. Not Miss Hartwell's doing at all. The cyanide was mixed into a sugared syrup before being poured. Only one person had reason and opportunity to add sweetness to Mrs. Weatherby's drink. Her housekeeper." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Poor Mrs. Turner. Devotion, Inspector, is far more dangerous than hate." Vale, and decided justice needed a domestic hand. She loved her mistress, but not enough to let her live unpunished. Craddock sighed. "You think she planted the locket in Vale's coat?" "Undoubtedly. She wanted him blamed, to make the punishment poetic, and when the guilt grew too heavy, she fled, knowing remorse travels faster than trains." Craddock shook his head slowly. "You never miss a thing, do you?" "Oh, I miss quite a lot," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "But fortunately, the things people try to hide most are usually the things they show first." As the inspector left, the church bells began to chime the hour. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window, her knitting waiting patiently beside her. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing a pale sky washed clean by morning light. She thought of Mrs. Weatherby, of Miss Hartwell, of Mrs. Turner, all women bound by their own kind of love, each undone by it in turn. The village would gossip, of course, but in time it would forget. Human nature, she reflected, forgets everything except itself. Turner's name returned to every tongue in Merry Mead. The air felt brittle, as if the frost itself were whispering rumors along the hedgerows. Miss Marple had woken before sunrise, the unease of unfinished things stirring her awake. Though the case now seemed complete, Miss Hartwell's confession recanted. Mrs. Turner, the likely culprit, she knew that truth rarely ended so neatly. Human nature did not close its doors quietly. It left them ajar, letting drafts of doubt in. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock appeared again, looking both weary and grim. "You were right," he said, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple offered him. "We found Mrs. Turner's body early this morning, down by the old mill stream. Looks like she drowned herself. There was a note in her handbag." Miss Marple set the teapot down with a soft clink. "Ah, I rather feared she might." Craddock unfolded a small sheet of paper, his voice low as he read aloud. "I didn't mean to do it. She was cruel, and I thought a taste of her own medicine might teach her mercy. But the world don't forgive women like me. Let it be over now." He looked up, troubled. "That settles it, I suppose." Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "Yes, Inspector, but it doesn't explain everything, does it?" "What do you mean? Why did she write the world doesn't forgive women like me?" "Guilt, yes. But there's something else beneath it. Self-condemnation, not just fear of punishment. I wonder what part of herself she thought unforgivable." Craddock frowned. "Perhaps she meant murder, or perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "she meant love." He blinked. Love? She adored Mrs. Weatherby, yet resented her just as deeply. It was devotion soured by humiliation. When affection curdles into resentment, it becomes its own poison. But I still believe there was one small truth she left unsaid. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the Weatherby estate once more, now silent except for the echo of her shoes on the marble floor. In the late widow's bedroom, she looked around carefully, noting the dust beginning to settle on untouched surfaces. The mirror above the dressing table was slightly tilted, its frame cracked where it had been struck. Beneath it, a faint outline on the wood, an oval shape where something had once lain. The locket. Miss Marple studied the mark for a long moment, then pulled open the top drawer. Inside were remnants of powder, hairpins, and a folded scrap of paper. The handwriting was Mrs. Turner's. It was not a note, but a fragment of a letter. "You mustn't worry, my dear. The Colonel will never know what we did with the accounts. I've put the papers away safe." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Oh," she murmured. "So that's it." She carried the note straight to Craddock, who listened in silence as she explained. "The accounts, Inspector, are the missing Weatherby investments. The Colonel's estate was smaller than people thought because his wife moved much of the money into her own name, or perhaps into Mr. Vale's ventures. Mrs. Turner must have known, perhaps even helped arrange it. Her loyalty made her complicit. When Mrs. Weatherby began to fear discovery, she threatened to expose everyone involved, including her housekeeper." Craddock's eyes widened. So Mrs. Turner wasn't just resentful, she was desperate. Precisely. She knew that once the truth came out, she'd lose not only her home but her reputation. A lifetime of servitude undone by a few ugly facts. When she poisoned that glass, I think she meant to frighten Mrs. Weatherby to stop her from talking. But she used too much, and after the deed was done, the guilt and the secret together were unbearable. He nodded slowly. Then the locket, the letter to Vale, even the masquerade, it all fits. She wanted to cast suspicion far away from herself, and the chaos of that evening gave her the chance. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Yes, and that is the true tragedy. Inspector, not the death, but the loneliness behind it. Every woman in this case was isolated by pride. Mrs. Weatherby by her arrogance, Miss Hartwell by her bitterness, Mrs. Turner by her shame. They were all, in their way, victims of the same poison. The need to control others while pretending to serve them." Craddock rose, tucking his notebook into his coat. "I sometimes think you see too much, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "One can't help seeing, Inspector, when one's lived so long. People always tell the truth eventually, only not with their words, with their habits, with the way they pour tea, or fold a letter, or remember to adjust a mirror. Human nature reveals itself in the smallest things." He tipped his hat, reluctant to leave. "Well, you've done it again. I suppose I should be grateful we have you in Mary Mead." "Gratitude is unnecessary," she said, with warmth. "Just keep your eyes open. The world is full of masquerades, and not all require costumes." When he was gone, the house fell silent once more. Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out at the fading evening. Beyond the hedges, the church bells tolled faintly, and a mist rose over the stream where Mrs. Turner had met her end. For a long while, she stood watching it, her thoughts far from sorrow or triumph, only understanding. Then she turned back to her knitting, the steady rhythm of the needles sounding like the heartbeat of a village that, though scarred, would soon pretend to forget. The following week passed with a strange stillness in Mary Mead, as though the village itself were exhaling after holding its breath too long. Newspapers had printed their columns, "Village Masquerade Ends in Tragedy," and by the time the last headline faded, the gossip had softened into sighs. Yet for Miss Marple, there lingered an unease, a single loose thread tugging at the edge of understanding. The case had concluded in the eyes of the police, but endings, she knew, were often a matter of agreement rather than truth. On a cold Thursday morning, she walked into the village grocer's, her basket swinging lightly. Behind the counter, Mrs. Bantry was in full flourish, telling anyone who'd listen that Mrs. Turner's sins had been punished and that justice, at last, had been done. Miss Marple listened quietly, smiling in the right places, but her mind wandered. Justice, she thought, was rarely so tidy. As she left the shop, she nearly collided with Adrian Vale, freshly returned from London. He looked thinner, paler, as though some invisible burden had followed him even from the city. "Miss Marple," he said with a strained smile, "I'm only here to collect a few papers. The solicitors are tying up Mrs. Weatherby's estate. I'd rather not stay longer than necessary." "Understandable," she said gently. "It must be difficult, returning to a place so full of ghosts." He gave a hollow laugh. "Ghosts, yes, and gossip worse than death. Still, I suppose I should thank you. I might have been hanged on hearsay." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I dare say you might have deserved suspicion, but not the rope." His face darkened, but she continued mildly. "Mrs. Weatherby's letter to you, was it your first quarrel?" He hesitated, studying her face. "No," he said finally. "She'd been threatening me for years. I managed some of her husband's investments abroad. When the markets fell, she blamed me, though she'd given the orders herself. She always wanted control, even over misfortune." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "A dangerous habit. It tends to end badly for everyone involved." She watched him go, his shoulders bowed beneath an invisible weight, and as he disappeared down the lane, something shifted in her mind. Control. That was the word she'd been missing all along. Control in love, in service, in guilt. Each woman Mrs. Weatherby, Mrs. Turner. Miss Hartwell had tried to wield it, and each had been undone by it. But Adrian Vale, he had been caught in their orbit, not by emotion, but by survival. And that, Miss Marple realized, made him the most dangerous kind of man, one who learned from other people's mistakes. That evening, she sat before her fire, the soft clack of her knitting needles marking time as thoughts fell into place. If Mrs. Turner had been complicit in financial deceit, Vale would have known. He might have used that knowledge. The letter threatening exposure could have meant ruin for him as much as for her. He'd had motive, but he'd also had intelligence, and intelligence rarely acts without cunning. Poison in the glass. A planted locket. A frightened housekeeper. All of it neatly positioned to direct suspicion elsewhere. The more she thought, the more the pieces aligned with uncomfortable precision. She rose, crossed to her writing desk, and penned a short note to Inspector Craddock. "Dear Inspector, humor me one last time. If you examine the champagne bottle under proper light, you may find residue not from sugar, but from wax. The kind used to seal vials, not corks. I believe Mrs. Turner poured from a bottle that had already been prepared for her by someone clever enough to know she'd take the blame." By morning, Craddock himself appeared at her door, flushed and astonished. "You've done it again," he said, holding up a small evidence bag. Inside lay the neck of the champagne bottle, where a thin rim of wax clung beneath the cork line. "We found traces of melted sealant and faint fingerprints, Vale's matching the ones on Mrs. Weatherby's desk drawer." Miss Marple sighed softly. Poor Mrs. Turner. She thought herself guilty when she was only used. Craddock's voice was tight. He must have known she'd pour the drink. He switched the bottles before the party, set the stage, and relied on her devotion to keep his secret. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. And once she was gone, and Miss Hartwell confessed out of guilt and confusion, he was safe again. But greed, Inspector, is never satisfied. It always leaves a mark. Craddock shook his head slowly. "We'll have him arrested before he leaves the county." "Good," Miss Marple said softly, "though I doubt he'll resist. Men like Mr. Vale rarely fight, they simply accept the fall as though it were another investment gone wrong." That evening, as twilight deepened over the village, Miss Marple walked through her garden, the scent of wet earth rising around her. The case, at last, had found its ending, not clean, not merciful, but true. She paused by her roses, brushing a faded petal between her fingers. 3 women, she murmured, and one man who thought himself cleverer than all of them. But cleverness, without conscience, is merely cruelty dressed in reason. From the church tower, the clock struck 9. Inside her cottage, the fire burned low, and her teacup waited untouched. She smiled faintly to herself, as she always did, when the pattern at last revealed its full design. Then, with quiet satisfaction, she picked up her knitting again, the gentle rhythm returning like a heartbeat restored to peace. The following day dawned with a brittle sunlight that did little to warm the chill still clinging to Mary Mead. The frost glimmered faintly on the hedges, and the lanes were quiet save for the sound of boots crunching over gravel. Inspector Craddock arrived before breakfast, his coat unbuttoned, his breath visible in the cold air. Miss Marple was already waiting for him, seated by her fire with her knitting in her lap and the kettle gently singing beside her. He didn't have to speak. The expression on his face told her enough. "He confessed then?" she asked softly. Craddock nodded. "Eventually. We caught him at the inn, ready to leave by the afternoon coach. Said he wanted to return to London, tie up affairs. We brought him in before he had the chance." He rubbed his forehead wearily. At first, he played the gentleman, calm as ever. Claimed Mrs. Turner acted alone, that she'd stolen from him as well. But when I showed him the wax residue and the bottle marks, his voice changed. Said he hadn't meant her to die either, that he only wanted to frighten her, to make her back down. The poison, he claimed, was meant as a gesture, a bluff that went too far. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Poison," she murmured, "is never a bluff. It's a choice made long before the bottle is opened. People imagine they can use it to frighten, to warn, to remind, and then are surprised when it behaves as poison always does." Craddock nodded slowly. He admitted he switched the bottles earlier that evening, before the party began. Mrs. Turner poured from the poisoned one, and by the time the lights went out, he'd already replaced it. When we searched his luggage, we found the wax seals, the chemist's note, even a second vial of cyanide half used. He'll hang for it, though he seems almost relieved. Said he was tired of being clever. Miss Marple's eyes softened. A dangerous fatigue, that. Clever men tire only when they realize the world is wiser than they thought. Craddock managed a faint smile. "You always see the heart of it, don't you?" She smiled back, though her expression was distant. "Only because I've had so many years to watch people mistake intelligence for understanding. They aren't the same thing, you know. Understanding requires kindness, and Mr. Vale, for all his brilliance, never possessed that." The inspector rose, slipping his notebook into his coat. "The trial will be quick, I imagine. The village will move on soon enough. But somehow, I think you'll still be thinking about it." "I always do," she said quietly. "Because behind every murder there's a sadness greater than the crime itself, the loneliness of the person who believed they were alone in their suffering." After he left, Miss Marple sat in silence for a long while, the fire flickering low, her thoughts moving gently between past and present. She thought of Mrs. Weatherby's laughter echoing through the hall, brittle and false, of Miss Hartwell's trembling hands as she confessed to a crime she hadn't committed, driven by guilt she didn't deserve, of Mrs. Turner, whose devotion had become her undoing, and of Adrian Vale, who had watched all three women like a man studying chess pieces, never realizing that every move he made drew him closer to checkmate. In the afternoon, she walked through the village. The fog had lifted, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and thawing earth. Passing the vicarage, she paused to greet Mrs. Bantry, who was trimming her winter roses. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry said breathlessly, "it's all settled now. How dreadful it must have been for you, knowing all those dreadful details." "Oh, not dreadful," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Just rather sad. You see, the masquerade didn't end when the music stopped, it merely revealed who the dancers truly were." Mrs. Bantry frowned, puzzled. "You do have a way of making murder sound almost poetic, Jane." Miss Marple smiled. "Poetry and crime are not so different, my dear. Both rely on hidden meanings." That evening, as dusk fell over Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned home and lit a single candle. The room glowed softly, shadows playing against the wallpaper like gentle ghosts. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, listening to the faint wind moving through the hedges. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, solemn and patient. She imagined the villagers closing their doors, drawing curtains against the cold, returning to their ordinary lives with ordinary secrets. In time, the story of the Halloween widow would fade into legend retold at teas and whispered in shops, losing its sharpness, its sorrow. But Miss Marple would remember the faces clearly. The widow behind her laughter, the nurse behind her duty, the housekeeper behind her loyalty, and the man behind his charm. Each of them had worn masks long before the night of the masquerade, and when those masks fell, the truth had been simple and terrible, as truth so often is. She lifted her teacup in a quiet gesture to the empty room. "To the living," she said softly, "and to the lessons they never quite learn." The fire crackled gently, and outside, the moon rose pale, serene, and watchful over a village that had once again convinced itself that nothing so dark could ever happen here.